Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and joining our meeting today for our presentation. And as a reminder, to improve the quality of your reception of the presentation, we're again asking you to ensure that the Zoom microphone and video on your device are turned off. And of course, just as a refresher, there is a microphone icon and a camera icon at the bottom, usually of your Zoom's window that you can click to ensure. And there's a red slash through each of those icons when you've succeeded in turning them off. We do have presentations scheduled for April and May as well, and we invite you to see the details on the events page of our website, civilwarstudygroup.org. We will also send out reminder emails in the weeks prior to these scheduled events. One last business item. If you are on this call, you are on our Zoom contact list. Going forward, we will keep your email on that list unless you tell us differently. As a result, you don't need to click the link to sign up for a future Zoom presentation. Someone has their I'm going to mute, I don't know who it is. I'm going to mute everybody, actually, mute all. And then I'll have to unmute our presenter. But anyway, so our speaker is Jim Lewis. Our speaker, Jim Lewis, is that rare breed of native Northern Virginia. As a matter of fact, his Northern Virginia family line goes back 9 generations, quite substantial. He graduated from George Mason University in 1971 and chose to have his diploma read George Mason College of the University of Virginia, since 1971 was a transition year for that institution. I share that distinction with him, although in 1968 I had no choice since university status at that point was still in the future. Jim retired from Xerox Corporation and lives in Reston, Virginia. He's been seriously busy for a lot of years in studying and preserving local history, including leading tour groups and authoring 30+ historical markers in Fairfax County. He's also served on the board of several history-oriented groups, such as the Bull Run Civil War Roundtable. He's authored several local history booklets on behalf of the Hunter Mill Defense League and assisted in the creation of their award-winning DVD documentary, Danger Between the Lines, which was shown on PBS TV. I'm now turning it over to Jim, and he's going to give his presentation, and I'm asking him to unmute.
I'm unmuted. You want me to share the screen?
Please do. Go ahead. Everybody, please pay attention to Jim's presentation.
Okay, great. I hope everybody can see that. Thank you, Charles, for the intro. Appreciate it. We finally got it done. Almost. One more hour, it will be done. But anyway, we had this scheduled some time ago, and I was going to drive down to your area and present this live. But of course, we had this little virus that popped up. So anyway, it's been rescheduled. As Charles said, I've done a lot of work up here in Northern Virginia, and I'm fairly well known in the area for doing tours, conducting local tours, and presentations such as this. I also do a lot of World War II stuff and colonial history, so on and so forth. I've written some things, and I was involved heavily in that DVD that Charles mentioned, Danger Between the Lines. So anyway, as I got involved in researching the local history here, it was really on behalf of the Hunter Mill Defense League that I did so. Because in my backyard, I have confirmed Confederate trenches. Fairfax County History Department, Archaeology Department came out for a couple of years, a number of years ago. They came out in the winter and they gridded, they measured everything, and our earthworks are logged and registered in Richmond, Virginia under an FX number, which is a historical designation. So anyway, as I was doing that and trying to figure out what these holes in my backyard were all about, I hooked up with Hunter Mill Defense League and started working on the Hunter Mill Road corridor history, which they were trying to preserve the area. They've done a very good job of doing that. As I got involved in that, I found out very quickly that Hunter Mill Road is connected to everything around here. And to not go to Fairfax or Vienna and learn that history really would have shortchanged the enrichment and the context of the story. So in the town of Vienna, I stumbled across this fellow, Charles Russell Lowell Jr. He was commander of the Union Cavalry Brigade on top of Air Hill. And I believe you all have already heard, a number of you, presentation by Jim Carson, who discussed and certainly mentioned Air Hill, A-Y-R Hill, H-I-L-L, in Vienna. And that was the name of Vienna before the town of Vienna was created in 1862, second year of the war, when it got its post office. So anyway, I came upon this fellow, and the more I read about him, the more enthralled I became. Even though he's not a nationally known figure, he is still revered in New England. And I think you'll understand why after I'm done with this presentation. Now, to begin with, I would assume everybody's familiar with the name Lowell. Does it ring a bell? Well, it certainly should, up in Lowell, Massachusetts. So let's go ahead and see if we could get this thing going. If I could. Presenter. Okay, here we go. Excellent. Charlie, and that was his nickname, Charlie Jr., i.e. Charlie, and you'll hear me call him that throughout the presentation. He was the eldest son of this fellow right here, his dad. He was born into a privileged Boston, Massachusetts family of Senior, and his mother was Anna Jackson. This is a photo of him at 8 years of age. And this is a photo of his mother at the end of the Civil War, 1865. For 9 generations, the family had been principal players in both the business and social circles of the city. Sadly, Senior lost a sizable amount of the family fortune during the Panic of 1837, which touched off a major recession lasting into the mid-1840s. Realizing he was not a businessman, he now spent his days preparing a card catalog for the Boston Library. So, and who ran the show? His mom, Anna. And any reversal of fortune for the family would now be left up to this little fellow right here. This is 1850, this photo. After 2 years of prep, in 1850, after 2 years of prep school, Charlie entered Harvard College at the age of 15. And he was ranked first in scholarship, and he remained there. He was especially fond of philosophy, science, and literature. He graduated 4 years later, valedictorian, at age 19. And this is that photo of Charlie when he graduated. His valedictorian address was called "The Reverence Due from Old Age to Youth." He argued the value of young men came from their ideas, not the physical labor. His plan now was to spend the next 10 years in business, making enough money to rebuild the family's finances and devote himself to public service. He could obviously have had any job he wanted, but he decided to go a different route. He picked a menial job as a laborer at a nearby iron mill to understand the working man's condition. Appalled by the terrible working conditions and squalor in which they lived, he began making plans for change. And when he would hold a position of authority. So, seeing enough, he accepted a promising management position with an iron company in New Jersey. However, he was soon found coughing up blood, stricken with TB, consumption. Doctors recommended he move to a warmer climate without work for 2 years. Instead, he opted for a career change into a healthier environment, taking a job at J.M. Forbes and Company, which is a prominent investment firm. However, his health continued to deteriorate. So he finally accepted doctor's orders and convalesced in Europe and North Africa 2 years. Wherever he stopped, he learned the language and developed into an accomplished equestrian and proficient swordsman, skills that would later serve him well. His illness went into remission and he returned to the United States. Back here, he accepted a job as an assistant treasurer and land agent position with the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad Company. That's out of Iowa. In his travels, he fell in love with and bought 200 acres near Dixon, Illinois. Now, remember that statement and that land, because it's going to come full circle at the end of the presentation. Realizing his passion for the iron industry, and quite frankly, it was really railroads. They were really hot at the time. He applied and became iron master at the Mount Savage Iron Works in Cumberland, Maryland. November 1860, Lincoln's elected, who Lowell supported. But Lincoln was a catalyst for the secession. Even with the bombardment of Fort Sumter 5 months later, on April 12, 61, Lowell, who was a passive abolitionist, continued with his efforts to rebuild the family's finances. 1 week later, this happened. The Baltimore riot of 1861. He was in Baltimore by coincidence and witnessed an angry mob attack his home state 6 Massachusetts volunteers while changing trains en route to Washington. This riot resulted in 4 killed and 36 wounded. So it changed everything for him. He immediately went to Washington, D.C. to apply for a commission of second lieutenant of artillery in the regular army. He applied directly to Senator Charles Sumner, stating of his qualifications, quote, as being able to speak and write English, French, Italian, German, and Spanish, and know enough of mathematics to put me at the head of my class at Harvard. I am 26 years of age, and I believe I possess more or less of moral courage about taking responsibility. Now you'll love this. He continued, which seems to be present to be found only in Southern officers. Obviously, he had that New England thing going on. And he had a bit of an attitude, but he was a real smart guy, and I guess he could get away with it. Anyway, his application was passed on to Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who was struck by his youthful appearance and asked, "What do you know of a horse?" Lowell's response, "Enough to take a hard day's work out of him and bring him in as fresh as night as any other man." Cameron was so impressed, particularly with all of Lowell's academic credentials, his equestrian skills, and whatever, that he walked in asking for a second Louis position. He walked out as a captain. And here he is as a captain with the 3rd Regiment of U.S. Cavalry, and that would later transform into the 6th U.S. Cavalry. So proficient in training that he was rewarded with the command of a squadron. Okay. Now, on April 1862, the 6th was transported down to Fort Monroe, Virginia, for McClellan's Peninsula campaign. There, Lowell distinguished himself leading saber charges at Williamsburg and Slatersville. For his performance, he's nominated for brevet to major. Within earshot of the raging 7 days battle, the 6th was encamped at Harrison's Landing. While there, Lowell took a deep personal loss as his younger brother, James, right here, was wounded at Glendale, later dying on July 4th. James, his brother, was a first lieutenant of the 20th Mass Volunteer Infantry. McClellan, you all know this fella here, noticed Lowell's nomination for promotion and brought him onto his staff. Now, the work wasn't very glorious. It's staff work. And it also kept him away from the fighting at Second Bull Run. However, things would again change. September 17th, 1862, our nation's worst day, Antietam. I don't know if you're aware of this. I've done a lot of work on Antietam, but between 6 a.m. in the morning in the cornfield through 9:30 a.m. in the East Woods, 12,000 casualties were sustained, which if you do the math, every second there was a casualty. The entire battle on this day, literally there were 3 battles, and the entire battle was over 12 hours, 23,000 casualties would occur. In essence, if you do the math, 1 casualty every 2 seconds. Well, how's Lowell connected to this? He was delivering orders for General Sedgwick's division in the West Woods. He found the line routed and in retreat. He immediately called for them to rally and stem the flow to the rear. Unbelievably, for some reason, they chose to follow this guy. And as a nearby officer recalled of Lowell, quote, "It seemed to me that no mounted man could have lived through that storm of bullets that swept through the Eastwoods just after I saw him enter it. His horse was struck 7 times, and another bullet ripped through his overcoat, and a final ball struck and shattered his scabbard. Miraculously, Charles himself was untouched." Now, as much of a wiseacre as he could be, he was never a braggart, really. And when he wrote home to his mother, he's simply saying, "I have had my usual good luck, but shall have to buy a new saber and shall have 1 horse the less to ride for a month or 2. So gives you a feel for him. Learning about Lowell's actions that day, McClellan rewarded Lowell by giving him the coveted honor of presenting the 35 captured battle flags to the Secretary of War in Washington. Soon after the battle, Lincoln fires McClellan yet again, November the 4th. And his staff is returned to their regiments, or they're looking for new assignments. Lowell, meanwhile, Governor Andrew of Massachusetts was looking to raise a 2nd Regiment of State Cavalry. Lowell came highly recommended to recruit, organize, and train that unit, or the unit being the 2nd Mass Cav. Governor Andrew was impressed and agreed without reservation. So Lowell got the job. Recruiting was tough in Massachusetts, and Lowell even had to shoot a mutinous ringleader after he had taken the oath of enlistment. And right here is the recruitment poster, and there's Lowell's name. And there's your 2nd Mass Cav right here. So his recruits also included the hand-picked elite from the West, and I'm talking California. They were led by the very capable J. Sewell Reed, who became, and that his outfit became known as the California Battalion. And they were sent here to Camp Meigs, some 9 miles from Boston by rail. Lowell also became involved in the recruitment of the 54th Mass with his close friend, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. And if you remember, we're talking Glory, the movie. He was commander of the 54th and also from a prominent New England family. The 54th was the first regiment, quote, of Negroes, quote, raised in the North. And here is a recruitment poster that they used. Ironically, the 54th basic training was also held in the same camp, Camp Meigs, In the winter of 1862 through 63, the two regiments, one black, one white, trained together. As fate would have it, Charlie and Rob attended a social where Charlie became infatuated with Rob's sister, Josephine Effie, Effie for short, Shaw, who was 10 years younger than the now 28-year-old Lowell. There's Effie. And this picture represents 1869, 4 years after the war. Effie was small, delicate, and beautiful. More importantly, she was the intellectual equal of Lowell. Educated in Paris and Rome, like Charlie, she had a deep love for literature and history. Effie reminded Charlie of his mother. Within 2 months, it was Charlie who had been recruited, and the two were engaged with a wedding date subject to, quote, military necessity. In other words, when can they get the heck out and get married? She even moved to Camp Meigs with Lowell's mother in order to be near her hero and future husband. By April, Lowell was formally appointed colonel and commander of the 2nd Mass. Early May, with the loss of 17,000 at Chancellorsville, fresh troops were needed by the Union Army. Charlie and the rest of the 2nd Mass were ordered to Camp Brightwood in support of the defenses of the capital. Close to the seat of war, Lowell continued to relentlessly prepare his men. His men noted that he was always there, going through the same exercises and drills, never tiring or sparing himself, always saving administrative details until the men were resting. It was on this duty that Charlie and Effie began to correspond almost on a daily basis, learning more about each other, and their love grew ever stronger. And there are accesses to these letters. There's a ton of information on the internet about Lowell and Josephine. So June 10th, Lowell received orders to track down some guerrillas who had attacked and burned the 6th Michigan Cavs camp before disappearing into the Maryland countryside. The locals just said, quote, they disappeared, unquote. And it became obvious the guerrillas were hiding in the houses and farms they had passed. Anyone take a wild guess as to who that might have been? Okay, enough time. Here you go. Mosby. Yep, Lowell had just initiated a year of contact between he and Mosby, which would see both victories and defeats, but never Mosby's outright destruction. Mosby was a master of hit and run operations and was nearly impossible to counter with conventional means. The only effective means of dealing with him was with the concept of, quote, total war, unquote, which had yet to come to Northern Virginia, but it was coming. Lee's retreat from Gettysburg provided Charlie his first taste of combat as commanding officer, as he successfully engaged the dismounted Confederate cavalry at Ashby's Gap, which is today's Route 50 up here. Just 3 weeks after Gettysburg, and with the nation beginning to have some sense of hope that the hostilities might end soon, tragedy struck again. This time, Effie was greatly affected. Yep, July 28th, the 54th Mass was obliterated at the ill-fated assault of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The regiment lost 272 of its 600 men charging the fort. Charlie had also lost one of his closest friends, Commander Robert Gould Shaw. There he is in the DVD, and that's Broderick. If I could get it right here, Matthew Broderick. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember his name. Now, he's also known as Ferris Bueller, so he's done quite a bit of work. But this movie was released in 1989, and this memorial was placed in Boston Common in Boston in honor of the 54th Mass. And there's Shaw commanding them right here. So just 3 days later, another clash with Mosby took place, and it became obvious that a concerted effort was needed to shut down the irregular operations. Washington responded by giving Lowell command of an independent cavalry brigade. Here we go with Vienna. The 13th, 16th New York Cav in his own second mass. Now, you're going to love this. Some will. Anyway, it's a great quote. Lowell welcomed the New Yorkers, although his own regiment considered the newcomers, predominantly Germans, as, quote, so much excess baggage to be taken care of. So the Californians kind of distanced themselves initially from the New Yorkers, if you will. Here's Vienna. And I would think that Jim Carson definitely showed you this photo and quite possibly this one. Right here is Lowell. As you could tell, he's short. I mean, he's a cavalryman. He was a lot like Mosby as far as height and stature and everything. Mosby's 5'7". So here's the brigade headquarters on Air Hill, as I mentioned earlier. And you'll notice there are no trees around. I mean, wherever an army went during the Civil War, you could forget the trees. They were gone because they were used for everything. He was also tasked with guarding the, quote, early warning defensive line for Washington, D.C. Now, here's a picture of his officers. I want you to remember this fellow right here. This is the surgeon, Oscar C. DeWolf. You will hear him speak later on. In August, Lowell got the upper hand on Mosby at Gooding's Tavern. That's right across from Northern Virginia Community College in Annandale. A second mass detachment put bullets in Mosby's thigh and groin, almost killing him. While Mosby recovered, Lowell concentrated on other guerrillas, primarily Elijah White and his 35th Battalion of Virginia Cav. They were also known as the Comanches. So in the fall, things literally did calm down a little bit. As things were calm, Charlie finally took leave and headed north, where on October 31st, Charlie and Josephine were finally united in marriage. Here they are, and there's Josephine. That's an actual photo of them during the wedding. After a few days together, both Effie and Charlie went back to camp in Vienna, and here they are. This photo was taken, this is the period photo. There's Effie and there's Charlie on top of Air Hill. This is where they lived, and this is the Hunter house. So while they were in Vienna, that was their abode right there. Daily patrols incurred continual contact with Mosby's men and other real regulars. Lowell detested what he called inglorious warfare. It was primarily reactive. His men called it police work. However, Charlie was good at it, just like about everything else he did. Periodically, he'd adjust his tactics, but Mosby and his Rangers would quickly adjust and things would go back to normal as usual. This is important that you understand this following statement. After the war, Mosby would write in his memoirs, quote, I have often said that of all the federal commanders opposed to me, I had the highest respect for Colonel Lowell, both as an officer and as a gentleman. So he knew Lowell was trying to put a bullet in him, but that's the respect that existed. So February 1864, appreciating Lowell's organizational skills, he's called on to go down to DC and straighten out the Army's remount supply system, basically horses at Geesboro Point in Washington. And this is really near today's Anacostia. While there, he efficiently overhauled the system and processed 20,000 horses. The end of March, Lowell was allowed to return to his brigade. Here's the depot headquarters. and here are the horse stalls down at Groesboro Point. However, while he was gone, tragedy struck yet again, February 22nd, 1864. While returning eastward from a Mosby hunting mission, a 150-man detachment of the 2nd Mass and 16th New York Cav, including J. Sewell Reed, was ambushed and routed by the Mosby Rangers. Mosby, there's a hill back here. You could barely see it. That's called Signal Hill. And this is where today's Northern Virginia Community College is located in Sterling, not far from the Costco, which is pretty much across the street. And Mosby was up here hiding, with his men, and they attacked the 2nd Mass and 16th New York this way, coming from Leesburg, going back to Tyson's, and then they were going to take a right and go back to camp in Vienna on Air Hill. So anyway, what occurred there, the end result was that 12 were killed, 25 were wounded, and more than 50 were captured, with 35 later dying at Anderson, Georgia. One of the casualties was J. Sewell Reed. He died in this activity. So that was a huge loss for the regiment and everything. No, this is at the memorial. This is what it looks like today on the campus. And in the middle is this plaque. The Anchors family had a home right here. And so this is where everybody was buried. It was a big farm, and a number of them were buried in this area. So early July, after all this, Lowell is called on to assist in defense of the nation's capital against Jubal Early when he came up and eventually attacked Fort Stevens. Lowell's personal actions saved the 2nd Mass from annihilation in the streets of Rockville against 2 brigades of Early's retreating force at that time. Late July, finally, Charlie is called on for far more important service, and Effie returned home 4 months pregnant. Hence, if you do the math and the timing, their child, who you will see and hear shortly, was conceived on Air Hill after he came back from Giesboro Point. So Effie, Effie returned home while Lowell was still in the area, but he was called on elsewhere at this point. Seeking an end to the war, USS Grant significantly altered military objectives, finally, by appointing Major General Phil Sheridan as commander of the Army of the Shenandoah. And I say finally, this is where they kick into total war. Finally, they have got to do something with the propagation of a war and the support system that the Confederates have in Virginia. And this is when they do it. So Sheridan is given orders by Grant to pursue a scorched earth policy, as the valley was a well-known primary north-south travel route and the breadbasket for the Confederacy. The objective, again, was to destroy the Confederates' ability to prosecute the war. When Sheridan, and here he is, learned of Lowell, he quickly gave him command of a cavalry brigade. Meanwhile, this fellow right here, here's Jubal Early, he settles into the valley. And this is after the Fort Stevens attack, where Lincoln is there and they're telling him to get down because a bullet's going to hit him. He had that big hat on, the whole thing. I mean, so that's what Early did. He settled into the valley. And this is when Lowell truly began to shine with his men. For weeks, Lowell's brigade maneuvered with the Army and fought almost every day. Sheridan was so impressed with Lowell, as he always was, responded quickly and effectively. After a reorganization in the cavalry, Lowell was rewarded by being given command of the Reserve Brigade, which is made up of the tough regular 1st, 2nd, 5th U.S. and his own 2nd Mass Cavalry. And it was considered to be the best in the service. The appointment was a high honor and due to Lowell's exceptional abilities. September 19th, Sheridan's trust in putting the young volunteer in charge of the regulars paid off with big dividends. The Battle of 3rd Winchester, as depicted right here. September 24th, Lowell excels again in Luray Valley, prompting Sheridan, and this is really cool. It prompted Sheridan to request a commission to Brigadier General for Lowell. Sadly, Lowell will never learn about this request, and you'll hear more about that in a second. As the fighting continued into October, this is the burning that took place. Lowell continued to excel. This burning resulted in 1,000 mills being burned, 2,000 barns, and 15,000 farm animals being killed. His letters home at this point tell Effie, it indicates that Lowell is conflicted with what he's being asked to do and the moral ambiguity. But he understands also that this is the task and this is what he has to do. Throughout the Valley campaign, Charles had lived a charmed life. He was never struck as men and horses fell all around him. By the way, he had 13 horses shot out from under him. You think he was in the action? Darn right he was. As the days of fighting wore on, he seemed to have a premonition, as revealed in letters to Effie, with comments like, quote, "I should like to have Sundays quiet, and I do wish this war was over." Most telling of all, this quote, I don't want to be shot till I've had a chance to come home. I have no idea that I shall be hit, but I want so much not to now that it sometimes frightens me," unquote. It was not to be. October 19th, Battle of Cedar Creek. Now, like you all, we've all been to a number of reenactments. I've been to Cedar Creek so many times, it's ridiculous. And I took these shots back in 2014. And what's cool about Cedar Creek, as most of you know, it's the only battlefield in America where reenactment can take place because it's a law. You can't. It just so happens the foundation owns the land here. That's why it's so popular with the reenactors to go up there. And it's huge. So it's a big deal. And it's typically, again, in October. And it's gorgeous up there. You're in the Shenandoah Valley. So anyway, General Early's supposedly beaten army turned on the 19th and launched one of the most daring and successful flanking attacks of its kind against Sheridan's ill-positioned army at Cedar Creek, which is just south of Winchester, Virginia, in a town called Middletown. Sheridan wasn't on the battlefield, and this is one of the reasons they were ill-positioned. He had just spent the previous night in Winchester, having just returned from a conference in Washington, D.C. So he was not on the battlefield at all. At 5 a.m., Early struck and in short order crushed two of the Union Army Corps. Lowell and the cavalry established a position at the extreme left where the brunt of the attack occurred in order to stabilize the line and buy time until Sheridan arrived back on the battlefield. And of course, here's a print of the attack and Sheridan coming back. This shows him arriving back to his men from Winchester, where Sheridan successfully rallied his troops. This today is where he ran into his troops right here. So that marker, a good old Virginia state marker, is on Route 11 coming from Winchester down to Cedar Creek or Middletown. This, by the way, is what the Valley Pike, Route 11, used to look like. Thought you'd appreciate that. So Lowell's men withstood 3 successive charges. And here we go again. He lost another horse. On the third charge, a bullet careened off a nearby stone wall and slammed squarely into Lowell's chest, but did not penetrate. A mushroom piece of lead was found nearby. Reeling in his saddle, he was helped to the ground. Dizzy, deprived of voice, sapped of strength, and with blood in his lips, he said, "It is my poor lung. I have not lost a drop of blood yet. I want to lead in the final charge." Most likely, that bullet collapsed one of his tubercular lungs, remember the TB, and he was bleeding internally. At 4 p.m., the order finally came for the counterattack. And Lowell said, quote, and this isn't true, but he said it, "I am well now." Too weak to mount his saddle without assistance, he was lifted and strapped into a saddle and rode to the front of 3,000 cheering cavalrymen. He summoned his strength, drew his sword, and whispered to an aide to sound the charge. The bugles gave the signal, and they rode rapidly towards the enemy. Now, you know you're famous when you get one of these. This is a depiction by famed illustrator J.E. Taylor of that attack at Cedar Creek, and that is Lowell right there. And if you can read this, it says Colonel Charles R. Lowell. And the Brinker House, this is in Middletown. I know where most of this stuff is and where this field is up there. So this was a charge that took place. And what happened right off the bat, just as they got into the thickest of the fire from the town, a cry arose, "The colonel is hit." He fell from his horse and was carried on a litter behind his men. The counterattack was successful and the village of Middletown was taken. Charlie was moved to a house in a village where, if you remember what I said, remember Dr. DeWolf, he starts to tend to Wolf at this point. Where did he tend to him? In this house. It's still there today. Ironically, Lowell's commission as Brigadier General of Volunteers was finally signed this very day. He was now 29 years of age and still not aware of his promotion. Dr. DeWolf's account of Charlie's last hours, and I'm going to read this. "There were 4 or 5 in the room. Lowell lay on the table, shot through the shoulder to shoulder. The ball had cut the spinal cord on the way. Of course, below this, he was completely paralyzed. 4 others were lying desperately wounded on the floor. One young officer was in great pain. Lowell spent much of his ebbing strength helping him through the straits of death. When he heard the groans of the rebel wounded that were brought in the yard, he sent me away to look at them." So as the night of the 19th, and this is the day of the battle, wore on and his strength failed, I said, and this is DeWolf telling Lowell, "Colonel, you must write your wife." He answered that he was not able, but I said it could be managed. So, putting a scrap of paper on a piece of board, DeWolf held his arm above him and putting a pencil between his fingers and holding the hand against the paper, he told him that I thought he could use his fingers. And thus he wrote a word or two of farewell to Effie. Lowell spoke less and less often. The following morning at 8 a.m. on October the 2nd, 2020th, Charles ceased to breathe the air of the earth. And Dr. DeWolf pronounced his death. Now, here's the report by Sheridan to Grant. There's Lowell in that report. Where was Sheridan? If you're familiar with Middletown, and in particular, the battlefield of Cedar Creek, you'll recognize this structure right here. as Bell Grove Plantation. And this is where Sheridan wrote the after action report. Lowell's loss was felt deeply within the brigade and the Army's high command. General Custer openly wept, shedding tears and saying, "This is the greatest loss the Cavalry Corps has ever suffered." Sheridan himself remarked, "I do not think there was a quality which I could have added to Lowell. He was the perfection of a man and a soldier." Another high official said, "I do not think there was any officer in all the Army so much beloved as Lowell." October 28th, Charlie's funeral was held here. This is up in Mount Auburn Cemetery, right outside at the Harvard Chapel in Cambridge. Folks, if you've never been to this cemetery, this is probably about the prettiest cemetery I've ever stepped foot on. It's incredible and very dated, as you might expect with the New England history. So here are the Lowell family plots with 15 immediate and extended family members. A veritable who's who attended this funeral, including Oliver Wendell Holmes, Julia Ward Howe, remember the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and his uncle, James R. Lowell, who was an ambassador, author, playwright. He was very well known too. Now, in retrospect, if Charlie had to give the ultimate sacrifice during the war, he would have probably deemed the Battle of Cedar Creek worthy. It, along with the fall of Atlanta, directly enabled Lincoln's re-election. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Lincoln had written a concession speech because this war had lingered after Gettysburg, and the public was turning against it big time. And who was he running against? His buddy. That's McClellan. He was going to give the South what they wanted, basically, give them favorable terms of peace, if you will. So this was a big deal. So anyway, Lincoln wrote that concession speech and put it in his drawer in his desk. And from Lowell's point of view, this so-called peace would have rendered pointless all that his kinsmen had died for. That house right here is directly across the street from the Wayside Inn, very historic inn. And right here is this memorial to Lowell. Now, this is a Confederate, this is a Southern town to this very minute. Folks from the Northeast came down. They wanted to know where he died, and right across the street, because that was private property, but the fellow here that owned the Wayside Inn let him put this memorial right here. Okay, back in Cambridge, he's memorialized big time. This is Harvard Hall. I took this picture, by the way. I tried like heck to get into it because I wanted to find this. It's a niche. Obviously, in a niche lies this monument, if you will, to Lowell, or a bust, if you will. This is called Annenberg Dining Hall. And here's a period photo, and you can see the niches. As you look down, you can see the bust and all that. Well, I tried twice and was unsuccessful. However, because Lowell's star as Brigadier General did not reach him before his death, Chaplain Charles Humphrey, with Lowell and the Second Mass, suggested to the sculptor that he put it in a spray of laurel, here's the star, under his bust, and there it may be seen. As Charlie was obviously unable to sign his new commission, the current Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, authorized an exception allowing his posthumous promotion to become official. Now, that's the story of Lowell. But everybody asks, what happened to Effie? And it is incredible what happened to her. Barely a month after Charlie's funeral, Josephine gave birth to their only child. And This child's name was Carlotta, named after Charlie. So they had one daughter, Carlotta. Josephine, right here, would spend the rest of her life as a widowed mother, never remarried, and dressed in black every day. She decided to honor the deaths of her brother, remember, James Shaw, and husband by becoming a social reformer. In 1874, she and Carlotta, her daughter, moved to Manhattan, where she became deeply interested in social problems in New York City. She would spend the next 35 years visiting prisons and poorhouses, campaigning for parks and better schools, and fighting for civil service reform and the rights of workers. 1876, she was the first woman appointed to the New York State Board of Charities. 6 years later, in 82, she was the founder of the New York City Charity Organization Society, which gave form and direction to all the efforts of distinguished philanthropists, I can almost say that, in the city, philanthropists in the city and beyond. And she guided it for 25 years. In 1890, she established the New York Consumers Union, her most wide-ranging and effective organization, which dealt with women's rights and working conditions. And it's been adopted and was adopted as chapters in many other cities across the country. There is a bas relief of Effie in 1899. In 1905, at the age of just 61, Josephine Shaw Lowell died of cancer at her home in New York City. Her memorial attracted hundreds of people and at least 50 eulogies, as well as articles, appeared in numerous daily newspapers. So respected was Josephine that the Josephine Shaw Lowell Fountain in Bryant Park today, behind the New York Public Library, was dedicated shortly after her death. And this is a photo, a period photo in 1934. That's what it looks like today. Now, people say, okay, how about Carlotta? Carlotta, this is a photo of her, 1888. Now, this is so cool. She lived with her mother and never married. Now, remember that 200 acres that I told you to please remember, and this would bring everything full circle? This is when I'm going to bring it full circle. Carlotta, and this was, this was 200 acres, again, that Charlie bought. Carlotta dedicated this as a park. In 1906, just 1 year after her mother died, and in memory of her parents, she donated this land to the city of Dixon, Illinois. It became a nature sanctuary and is known as Lowell Park. This is Woodcote College, a cottage, and it's a signature structure, and it was built out of timber and native limestone quarried on the site. Now, Dixon residents have made good use of this park over the years. I thought you'd get a kick out of this. Between 1926 and 1933, and we're talking through a good part of the Depression, it employed a little-known lifeguard at the time at the Rock River Beach. He's shown here on the cover of the Lowell Park book. I would assume some of you have figured it out. If you haven't, there he is. Yep, our 40th president, Ronald Wilson Reagan. And he is reported to have saved 77 people from the river during his tenure. Okay, time to wrap it up. Carlotta died on September 19th, 1924, and was laid to rest with her parents. And here is her gravestone. And there's Charlie and Effie right here. You'll see Josephine and, of course, Charles. And this is up there in the Mount Auburn Cemetery. Charles and Josephine had become the useful citizens they had privately expressed in their letters to each other. He through duty on the battlefield, and she who learned to perform as a citizen. Never desiring a military life, Charlie had been drawn into the nation's conflict through an inert sense of duty. He was a born cavalier, high-spirited, quick, flashing his plans into instant orders and pushing his orders to prompt execution. Yet with all this dashing, chivalrous spirit, he was always calm and self-possessed. He led from the front. How many, how many horses were shot out from under him? He was in the front, and his men readily followed. His superiors admired his intellect, leadership, and bravery. There is little doubt his qualities were coveted by both sides of the conflict. One can only imagine what he might have achieved had he survived the war. It's been my honor and privilege to have presented the Charles Russell Lowell Jr. story. Thank you for your time and consideration.
So thank you very much, Jim. That was an excellent presentation, and I really especially appreciate the extension at the end, talking about the achievements of his wife, and also of his daughter that he never met. It's these things really are important to know. Now, I sent a message to everybody who is online now. There is a chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. It's shaped like one of these call out things that you see in comic books. Do we have any questions, please? Either use the chat feature. We don't have any questions on the chat feature, so if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask a question at this time.
Well, Jim, if you'll permit one question from Jack Fend here. I wonder, in your own mind, not that I realize it's purely speculative, but what do you think Lowell's fate would have been if he had survived the war? What would he have done?
Well, he would, in my opinion, he would have gone back into civilian life and became a useful civilian, much like Josephine did. This is my opinion. And he would have also, he could have done anything, but he was dedicated to fixing his family fortune. That was his focus. I don't know if it changed as a result of the war, but that was certainly what he wanted to accomplish, before the war started and everything. So I think things would have been different for Carlotta too. It sounds to me like it would have been different for Carlotta too. It sounded to me like she lived a rather lonely, inclusive life. And
reclusive.
Yeah.
Do you think that he would have involved himself in politics?
Very possibly. But I hate to see somebody get ripped up in politics, given what we all know. Yes, he could have. And boy, he would have been needed because Reconstruction was an ugly period, as you know. And anybody with his intelligence may well have potentially assisted the effort. And it was desperately needed.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thanks for attending.
Wouldn't miss it.
Any other questions? Please unmute yourself and.
Thank you for just a wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it. I haven't done it. Lowell is a favorite of mine. And I could tell you, I'm a Virginian. So I kind of, you know, my loyalty, if you were to truly ask about it, is kind of with Virginia. And, but you have to acknowledge quality when you see it. And this guy was great. Led from the front, smart, did all the dirty work, all the things you would expect a leader to do, and very few actually do. So, you know, give him a credit. And the more I read about this, wow, particularly with the love story embedded with Effie. And they wrote almost every day back and forth. A lot of these letters are available, you know, and that's where, with a lot of documentation behind it, I was able to weave this story together.
Jim, we have in the chat feature, someone has asked, Tom Newbick has asked, who won between Lowell and Mosby?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say it was a stalemate while Lowell was around. The problem is that Lowell would adjust his tactics. And I mean, they shot Mosby a number of times. And he was out of commission a number of times also. But he always came back, and it was either him or his Rangers. He recruited the best. I'm talking Mosby. And his guys were living, you know, in the homes in the area and all of that. So they had all the intel in the world, and they would adjust almost on the fly to anything they might run into. So if you're not aware of this, Mosby, our Spec Ops group still studies Mosby tactics to this very day. And believe it or not, Mosby was not for slavery. And he was against the secession thing. But he, like Robert E. Lee, made a decision to go with the state of Virginia, which is the way it was back then. So, you know, we got a lot of people making judgments today, but you have to go back to the way things were at the time to truly understand why. Does it justify it today? I don't know. That's debatable. But back then it was fully understandable. People went to war with their friends, their brothers. There were families that were split apart too, this whole thing. We're all familiar with that. So, I tell you, Lowell, if he could have been Mosby, I think he would have been just as good. I'll put it that way.
But that distinct disadvantage of not knowing the area to the extent that Mosby and his people did would have to have been.
Well, I tell you, there's a real quick quip I'll make a statement of. You're all familiar with the McDowell map, right? It's a very famous Irvin McDowell map. And he was the first general with the First Army in the East for the Union. And he's the fellow that went out and, in essence, lost First Manassas. And he started an effort before they went to Manassas to start mapping Northern Virginia. And the Battle of First Manassas took place before the map was finished. Well, after the battle, there was a little bit of renewed emphasis on finishing that map. So they brought the McDowell map out in January of 1862, and then it was further added to with more information in August of 1862. And there is a saying, that is, the Union knew what was on McDowell's map. Mosby knew everything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus, he and his men traveled the roads not identified on the McDowell map, which speaks to exactly what you're saying. They lived here. They knew where everything was.
Yeah.
Major advantage.
I think so.
Yeah.
Hey, Jim, this is Joe Hocus. I just wanted to comment that I thought it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Some of us, where we are, know a little bit about Wilderness and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, but we know, I think, at least certainly for me, know relatively little what happened in detail in Civil War battles in other parts of Virginia even. So I'm sure we all learned a lot from your presentation today, and I thank you again.
You're very welcome. I appreciate it. Nice meeting you all.
I'll definitely second that. And with that, we have no further, if no one else is activating their mics. So we'll thank Jim Lewis once again for his excellent talk, and we will end the meeting. A recording of the meeting will be made available. I'll send out the link probably later today. So thank you very much, Jim, and everybody have a great weekend.
Charles, take care. Maybe another time.
Okay, yes, indeed. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.